there, I'm Alex, a postgraduate researcher in creative writing and literary studies, and what you see before you is a recorded version of the presentation I gave at the South Australian Gender, Sex and Sexuality Conference in September of 2019. As I've done before, I'm uploading this here to make it accessible for anyone who's interested, whether that means it helps out your own research, or if you just think it's kinda neat. So without further ado, today what I am doing is drawing you into the wonderful, magical, spooky world of Shannon Maguire's 2016 novella Every Heart a Doorway. This book asks, what happens to the kids who come back from those portal fantasy adventures we all know and love, but can't quite adjust to life back in the so-called real world? On a deeper, even more metatextual level, the story also asks, what if we took all that queerness bubbling away in the portal fantasy genre and brought it to the surface? Every Heart a Doorway is the first book in a series, and has since been followed by 4 going on 5 prequels and sequels that form a sort of expanded universe, mapping out the adventures of various characters and their experiences in the various portal worlds where their adventures took place, from windswept moors populated by classic movie monsters, to surprisingly sinister kingdoms made from candy, to goblin markets, to fairy lands, and everything in between. These are all delightful in their own way, but since Doorway can be read as a standalone, and because it introduces and crystallizes the themes and devices I'm talking about most effectively, I'll be focusing mostly on that, unless a nod to another book in the series is particularly relevant. While there are many aspects to talk about and how the series plays with the conventions of the genre, what I'll be diving into today is how it brings queer reps explicitly into a type of story that's been read queerly for a long time, creating in the process a dual layer of queer allegory and queer truth that readers can find resonance in, and why that's neat and why that's important. So when I talk about queer reading strategies or queer readings of texts here, I'm referring to, quote, strategies that readers may apply to unearth queer meanings in ostensibly straight texts. Sometimes these strategies are in place so readers can read between the lines, so to speak, and spot queerness hidden in media in various forms of subtext and coding. Sometimes this means spotting familiar aspects and allegories in the overarching themes of a work, often tying in with the concept of resonance that I'll elaborate on more in a moment. And sometimes it involves conscious political rebellion and an active sense of reclamation or even appropriation. You didn't make this thing for us necessarily, but this thing speaks to us, and so it's ours now, and there's nothing you can do about it. Drawing from earlier scholars like Eve Sedgwick, queer media scholar Bonnie Ruberg wraps a lot of her definition of a queer reading around the idea of resonance, i.e. when a text personally resonates with the audience. So do you relate to the text? Does the text speak to you and your experiences as a queer person, whether it engages with queerness directly or not? Do the themes of the text strike a chord? Are there elements of the plot or world building that you can see queer allegory in? These are all potential sites of resonance. So, for example, while there aren't that many canonically queer superheroes, superhero genre is one that a lot of queer readers find resonance in, for all of its dealing with secret identities and non-normative bodies. It's a documented phenomenon that a lot of trans kids growing up in the 1990s felt a personal connection to K.A. Applegate's Animorph series about shape-shifting teenagers. And any story that stars a ragtag team of outcasts and misfits in any sort of found family configuration will likely find a dedicated queer audience, since we connect strongly to that sense of non-traditional family structure and community building. I reckon this is part of why we all like Dungeons & Dragons so much, but that's a topic for another day. So the portal fantasy genre, which is your Alice in Wonderlands, your Chronicles of Narnia, and your Wizard of Oz, is one that a lot of queer readers have found that sense of resonance in. As some examples, influential queer media scholar Alexander Doty looked at the Wizard of Oz through a queer lens in his essay My Beautiful Wickedness, The Wizard of Oz as Lesbian Fantasy, using those queer reading strategies to suggest this magical adventure as not just a whimsical romp through an imaginary land, but an extended metaphor for Dorothy's exploration of her own budding queer identity. In a similar vein, Caitlin L. Ryan and Jill Herman Wilmarth make a case for a queer reading of Where the Wild Things Are, which they note is also about a kid escaping his constricting home life and finding community where he fits in this case in a magical world full of monsters who are just as wild as he wants to be. In this fantasy space, the rowdy Max is able to explore his self-expression outside the constraints of the norms of the real world. And recently and famously, plenty of readers and analysts have noted the queer resonance and catharsis to be found in Harry Potter. As noted on the screen there, the kid was quite literally forced into a closet for being implicitly different to his very normal and very normative family members, only to later find a sense of community among others like him. J.K. Rowling's authorial bumbling away and queer rep aside, as readers it's pretty easy to find a sense of that resonance in the text and find queer allegory peeking out from between the lines. So there's queer resonance aplenty to be found in the portal fantasy genre, and many readers, particularly young ones, found a sense of home in these stories about venturing to other worlds and having adventures. In her essay Through Doorways, Portal Fantasies as a Means of Queer Escape and Queer Hope, author A.J. Hackworth reminisces that growing up queer in a stifling, dusty stretch of rural America, similar to Dorothy, she found an oddly personal sense of escapism and resonance in books about children fleeing the real world and travelling to fantastic realms instead. Obviously, the escapist elements of the portal fantasy concept can appeal to all sorts of children, but Hackworth noted that there was a special potential there for queer kids who already found themselves othered in the real world, and to whom the idea of escaping to an other world may have been particularly appealing. So, like masked superheroes, shapeshifters, and ragtag teams of lovable rogues, these stories have a wide appeal, but also tend to have more specific magnetism to queer readers. It's for this very reason that Hackworth finds Every Heart a Doorway so interesting and so special, since it acknowledges that resonant undercurrent that kids like her have been finding in these types of stories forever, and brings it right to the surface. So let's get into Every Heart a Doorway and its double layer of magical metaphor and queer representation. The central cast is comprised of so-called wayward children who long to return to the fantasy worlds they travelled to, but by the laws of the genre they're in, they are expected to leave behind and return to normal. This disconnect and inability to fit back into the norms expected of them seems them drawn to the boarding school/group therapy centre that is the novel's main setting, Eleanor West's School for Wayward Children, where they find a sense of community among other teenagers and young people who have had similar experiences and who identify with a similar sense of displacement, otherness, and yearning. You can probably already pick up on the queer echoes in that sentiment, but let's unpack it a little further, looking at a couple members of our main cast, our protagonist Nancy and the twins Jill and Jack, and how they flourish in their respective portal worlds in ways the real world would never let them, and what exactly that thematic narrative is saying to us. Nancy is the newest arrival at the Home for Wayward Children, recently returned from a trip to a land called the Halls of the Dead. She had a great time there and has thus taken to dressing in the monochrome style that the Halls of the Dead favoured. However, when she opens her suitcase after settling in at school, she discovers that the black and white clothes she packed have been thrown out and replaced by a wardrobe full of colours. It becomes clear that the case has been repacked without her consent by her parents, as it also contains a letter from Nancy's mother in which she delivers a very twee non-apology about how these clothes used to be her favourite, how they really do just want what's best for Nancy, and how they want their real daughter back. Nancy, needless to say, is not particularly happy about this casual and apparently well-meaning invasion of her privacy and erasure of her chosen mode of self-expression. The scene serves to set the tone for the exploration of parent-child relationships throughout the novel and the queer themes to be found therein. In the family dynamics that are discussed and described within the book, there are some notable commonalities in the attitudes and behaviours these parents have towards their children. These parents are not expressed to be outright abusive or deliberately cruel, but they misunderstand their children in such a way that their attempts at care manifest in damaging ways. Lines like, "We want our real daughter back," highlight what is to become a recurring motif. Parents with specific expectations for and perceptions of their children, which, when contradicted by the actuality in front of them, lead to discomfort in the parent and efforts to return their child to quote-unquote normal. This is a relationship and behavioural pattern that, unfortunately, many queer youth will be familiar with. On a small scale, it has echoes of microaggressions like referring to one's lovers as friends or refusing to use the correct pronouns. On a larger, darker scale, you could note that from the parent's perspective, sending their children away to get back to normal seems to have a lot in common with something like conversion therapy. The School for Wayward Children is really a welcoming, supportive, magical community in disguise, but they don't know that. The parents in Every Heart a Doorway don't understand nor believe the change that their children have undergone, a reflection of how adults rarely believe in magic and portal fantasy adventures, but also a device that is woven through with queer themes. Rather than this parental disconnect being something queer readers can simply find Ruberg's resonance in, however, the focus characters going through these experiences are all explicitly dealing with expressions of their gender and or sexuality themselves, placing queerness directly in the narrative as well. Part of trying to get Nancy back to normal, for example, is her parents encouraging her to go on dates with boys. They make this assumption and act on it with two misunderstandings in play. Firstly, on the fantastical level, they fail to comprehend that Nancy really did spend time in a magical underworld and that she had a positive experience there. And secondly, on the level that engages directly with the queer narrative, they fail to comprehend that Nancy's asexual identity makes romantic engagements much more difficult to navigate than they would be for a heterosexual teenager, which of course her parents presume they're raising. As Nancy herself observes, their love wanted to fix her and refused to see that she wasn't broken. By contrast, Nancy found much more understanding and catharsis under the guardianship of the Lord and Lady of the Dead, going so far to describe their world as home and, spoiler alert, going so far as to upend the traditional portal fantasy formula by choosing to return there at the end of the novel, rather than remaining in the real world. This serves not just as a sneaky subversion of the usual portal fantasy tropes, but contains an undercurrent of queer narrative too. Returning to the dominant norms of society might not suit everyone, and not everyone might fit into what we consider the traditional pattern of the coming-of-age story or the happy ending. And sometimes your biological family isn't home, and it's better for you to get out of there. The twins Jill and Jack, born Jacqueline, are two other characters corralled into constructed norms that don't suit them by parents that, while not setting out to be cruel, have a negative and very emotionally abusive effect on their children. In Jack's own words, our parents were, let's go with overbearing, the sort who always wanted to put things into boxes. To cut a long story short, Jill and Jack's folks have some very prescriptive ideas about gender roles that they enforce onto their children, as Jack herself explains in that quote up there, and as is explored further in the prequel about their adventure down among the sticks and bones. Once they get into the dark gothic portal world of the Moors, the twins are given the opportunity to break free from the gendered molds their parents worked so hard to pour them into. Jill was raised as a tomboy, as a sort of substitute son that her father always wanted, and in the portal world embraces the femininity she was denied, living lavishly as the protege to a vampire. Meanwhile, Jacqueline escapes from the femininity that was forced onto her by her mother's desire for the perfect daughter, instead giving into the unladylike world of mad science, adopting a more masculine or butch style of dressing, going by Jack, and eventually starting a relationship with a girl named Alexis. The fantasy world provides an escapist, queer-friendly space where Jack is given room to explore and embrace her sexuality, her gender presentation, and her identity in ways she would not have been afforded in the real world. For Jill and Jack, their fantasy world lets them spread their wings and find themselves in its suspension of the normative rules of the real world and the norm-enforcing authority of their parents in particular. They find much more freedom of expression with their adoptive parental figures, vampire and mad scientists respectively, much like Nancy found freedom and validation under the guardianship of the Lord and Lady of the Dead. So there's that sense of found family again. It's far from the image of a heterosexual, heteronormative nuclear family that their birth parents prioritised, but that pristine image is also expressly something that the sisters had to escape to be their true selves. For both Nancy and Jack, and some other characters too, who I'm unfortunately not discussing today in the interest of time, we see this recurring theme of these other worlds supporting, nourishing, and providing a home for these characters in a way that the mimetic world and the normative adult authority there never did, and it's implied never really could. It takes the escapism that was always found in the portal fantasy concept and makes it explicitly queer. It's this that makes Every Heart a Doorway such an interesting, playful, and important work. These stories of kids slipping through the cracks, finding themselves in a strange new place, and embracing and finding their true inner selves, are woven through with echoes and allegories for queer experience and identity forming, intermingled with the magic and metaphor. But they're also stories with canonically queer heroes. Doy then gives us this double layer of resonance, and, if you'll pardon the pun, maybe even opens the door for more and deeper queer interpretations and explorations of this genre, and others like it. And that brings us to the end of this adventure. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and or intriguing, and or I convinced you to read this cool little book if you haven't already. As with my presentation on Life is Strange and Until Dawn, which is also uploaded here, this will hopefully be turned into a scholarly paper probably sometime next year, where I'll have more time to flesh out some of those concepts like queer reading strategies, and I'll have time to talk about Eleanor and Cade, characters from the book who I unfortunately had to cut from this to keep it within my designated time slot. Thank you to the SAGSS conference for having me. It was really fun, a rewarding couple of days, and thank you for taking an interest in my work. If you want to find more of my stuff, the best place for that is probably Twitter, where I'll link my academic work as well as my essays and feature articles and copious opinions about young adult fiction and anime and other things that no one asked for, but are hopefully fun to read. You take care, and I will see you next time.